Hey, welcome back. Today we're doing something a little different. Instead of just talking about history, we're going to live it. I want you to imagine for a moment that it's October 8th, 1871. You're in Chicago. You've got a decent life. Maybe a small house on the west side, a job at one of the lumber yards or packing houses, a family sleeping in the next room. The city around you is booming. Chicago is the American success story of the 19th century. It grew from a muddy trading post to a city of 300,000 people in less than 40 years. Everyone is proud of that. Everyone talks about it. What nobody talks about is how dangerous it is. Because here's the thing, and this is something the history books often gloss over. Chicago in 1871 was essentially a city built to burn. And on the night of October 8th, it did exactly that. So today, I'm going to walk you through the Great Chicago Fire from the ground level. Not from a textbook, not from a Wikipedia summary. I want you to experience what it was like to actually be there. The sounds, the smells, the terror, and honestly, the strange moments of humanity that showed up in the middle of all that destruction. Let's go back. To understand what happened on that Sunday night, you first need to understand what Chicago actually was in 1871. Think of it less like a modern city and more like a massive, sprawling construction site that never stopped building. Chicago had exploded in population after the Civil War. Soldiers came home and headed west. Immigrants poured in from Germany, Ireland, Scandinavia. The railroads made Chicago the center of American commerce. Grain, lumber, livestock, all of it moved through this city. And because everything was growing so fast, there was no time to slow down and think about safety. Nearly 2/3 of Chicago's buildings were made entirely of wood. That's not an exaggeration. The sidewalks, the actual sidewalks people walked on every day, were wooden planks. The roads were paved with wooden blocks called Nicholson pavement. Even some of the bigger, more impressive-looking buildings that appeared to be stone had wooden interiors, wooden floors, wooden roofs. Now add to that, the summer and early fall of 1871 had been brutally dry. Chicago had received barely a fraction of its normal rainfall. The whole city was essentially tinder. Firefighters were exhausted from battling smaller fires throughout September and into early October. The fire department was understaffed and overworked. And then came the night of October 8th. One more thing before we get into it. You've probably heard the story about Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicking over a lantern in a barn. That's the legend. We'll get to that. But I want you to hold that image loosely, because the real story is both simpler and more complicated than a cow with bad aim. It's Sunday. The city is winding down for the night. People have gone to church, had their dinners, maybe sat on their porches in the cooler evening air. Children are in bed. The streets are quieter than weekday nights. There's a faint smell of smoke in the air, but that's not unusual. Chicago always smelled faintly of smoke. There had been a fire just the night before, actually, a big one on the south side that burned out a 4-block area and wiped out a planing mill. The fire department had been up all night fighting it. So the firefighters on duty the evening of October 8th are tired. Their equipment has been stressed. Some horses are worn out. And the night watch system, a series of fire alarm boxes connected to a central station, is being monitored by a man named Matthias Schaffer up in the courthouse tower, keeping an eye on the city. It's around 8:30 in the evening. On the west side, in a neighborhood called DeKoven Street, something starts in a small barn behind the home of Patrick and Catherine O'Leary. Exactly what started it, nobody knows for certain. The cow story came from a newspaper reporter who basically made it up to make the story more colorful, and he later admitted as much. The actual cause of the fire was never officially determined. Theories have included a neighbor smoking a pipe in the barn, a group of men gambling back there, spontaneous combustion in the hay. Take your pick. What matters is this. At roughly 8:45 p.m., a fire breaks out in that barn, and the wind, blowing strong from the southwest, picks it up almost immediately. Here's where it gets painful, because the Great Chicago Fire could have been stopped, or at least contained significantly. The alarm goes out, but not right away, and not correctly. A man named Bruno Goll, who ran a drugstore nearby, noticed the fire early and tried to activate the nearest alarm box. But the box he ran to was broken, or he couldn't get it to work properly. So he ran to find someone who could alert the fire department another way. Meanwhile, Matthias Schaffer, up in his tower, actually saw the fire, but he misidentified the location. He called in the fire to the wrong box. Box 342, which sent firefighters to the wrong part of the city. They showed up, saw nothing, and had to wait while the actual fire grew larger. This kind of thing, small failures, bad luck, slightly wrong information, is how disasters actually unfold. Not one big catastrophic mistake. A series of small, almost mundane errors that chain together. By the time firefighters got to DeKoven Street, the barn was fully involved, and the fire had already jumped to a neighboring shed, then to a house, then to another house. The southwest wind was throwing sparks and embers ahead of the flames, starting new fires on rooftops before the main blaze even arrived. Think about what that means for a moment. The fire wasn't just advancing, it was teleporting. Embers would land on a roof 2 or 3 blocks ahead, start smoldering, catch, and then that building would be burning from the inside out, even as the main wall of fire was still working its way closer. The fire department did fight hard. This is worth saying clearly because the firefighters of 1871 Chicago deserve credit. They showed up, they worked through exhaustion, they tried everything, but they were outmatched from almost the beginning. By around 9:30 p.m., 1 hour after the fire started, it was already clear to experienced firefighters on the scene that this was something different, something worse, and the city was beginning to wake up. Let me try to paint this picture for you. Imagine you're a 30-year-old resident. You've been asleep for maybe an hour or two. Your wife is next to you, the kids are down the hall, and then you hear it. Not an alarm, not someone knocking on your door, but a sound that starts as a distant roar and gets louder over the next few minutes. Like weather coming in. You get up. You look out the window. To the south or the west, the sky's orange. Not just glowing orange. Vivid, almost daylight orange, with pulses of brighter light when something new catches. You can see the silhouettes of buildings against it, and things are falling from the sky. Not rain, embers, little burning pieces of material drifting on the wind like hellish snow, landing on your roof, your porch, your neighbor's fence. The smell hits you next. Not just smoke, but the specific smell of burning wood, burning hay, burning fabric, burning everything all at once. People in their nightclothes are in the street. Some are running toward the fire to see it, because that's what humans do. We're drawn to disasters. We can't help it. Others are running away from it. Some are standing completely still, trying to figure out which direction is safe. Horses are screaming. That sound, and multiple survivors mentioned it specifically, was one of the most disturbing things. Horses in their stables, horses on the street, horses that could sense what was coming long before the humans around them really processed it. Church bells were ringing. Every church steeple that still stood was ringing its bell, the traditional fire warning, and the overlapping cacophony of dozens of bells from across the city mixed with the roar of the fire itself and the screaming of animals and people. You have maybe 30 minutes to decide what to do. This is something that doesn't get discussed enough when people talk about the Chicago Fire. Survival in the Great Chicago Fire depended enormously on the decisions people made in those first 30 minutes after they woke up or first realized what was happening. And those decisions had to be made with incomplete information, in the dark, with children and elderly relatives and animals, and all the physical stuff of your life surrounding you. Do you stay and try to fight the fire if it reaches your building? Most people who tried that died or barely escaped. Do you run immediately, taking only yourself and your family? Most people who did that survived, but it meant leaving everything. Your money, your furniture, your photographs, your documents, everything. Do you try to save some things first, load a wagon, take what you can? This cost precious time, and people misjudged how fast the fire moved, and which direction do you run? The fire was being pushed northeast by the wind, so running northeast was running into more fire. Running northwest or southeast, depending on exactly where you were, gave you a better chance. But in the darkness, in the chaos, with smoke obscuring your vision and everyone around you shouting conflicting information, it was genuinely hard to know which way was actually safe. One man named Alexander Freer, who later gave one of the most vivid first-hand accounts of the fire, described trying to navigate through streets that were completely gridlocked with people and wagons and animals, all trying to escape in different directions. The streets were designed in a grid, but the bridges over the Chicago River, the escape routes to the north side, were already clogged. And the fire was moving toward those bridges. People threw mattresses in the river and swam across. People waded through water up to their necks carrying their children. People pushed their elderly parents in wheelbarrows. The specific details that survive from eyewitness accounts are the kinds of details you couldn't invent. A woman clutching a bird cage, running down a burning street, refusing to let go of it. A man dragging a heavy trunk full of household goods, abandoning it block by block as he realized he couldn't carry it any further, finally running with nothing at all. A family loading their piano onto a wagon, their piano, and then watching the wagon catch fire 3 blocks later. People are not rational in disasters. We know this now from modern disaster psychology, and we can see it clearly in the accounts from that night. People grab things that matter to them emotionally but not practically. They go back for things they shouldn't go back for. Here's something that surprised people at the time and surprises people even now. The Chicago River didn't stop the fire. Common sense says a river should be a natural fire break. All that water. The fire can't cross water, right? Wrong. The fire crossed the river multiple times. Because it didn't need to travel through the water. It traveled over it, through the air. The wind was carrying burning brands, chunks of burning wood and material, that landed on the other side and started new fires there before the main blaze had even reached the river bank. There was also highly flammable material right along the river. Wooden docks, lumber yards, warehouses full of grain and oil and other combustibles. So when the fire reached the river, it essentially leapt across. The south branch and the main branch of the river were both crossed. The north side, which many people had fled to thinking they were safe, suddenly found itself in the path of the fire too. This is about 3 or 4 hours into the fire now. It's midnight, maybe a little past. The fire started around 8:45 p.m., and now the entire business district, the core of the city, the commercial heart of one of America's greatest cities, is beginning to burn. The Tribune building, the Chamber of Commerce, the elegant hotels, the banks, the courthouse, where the city's official records were kept. One of the more heartbreaking details of the fire is what happened at the courthouse. Officials tried to rescue the city's records as the building began to burn. They managed to get some things out. But the courthouse had a jail in its basement, and when the fire reached the building, there were still prisoners inside. The sheriff made the decision to release them, open the cells, and let them go. Some of those men helped carry records out before they fled. Others just ran. One man apparently refused to leave his cell at first, convinced it was a trick. The courthouse's bell, the great bell that had been ringing the fire alarm all night, crashed down when the tower collapsed, and the sound of it could reportedly be heard for miles. The north side of Chicago in 1871 was, by some measures, the most fashionable part of the city. This was where wealthy merchants and businessmen had their mansions. Wide streets, larger lots, more expensive construction, though still, in many cases, construction that burned easily. When the fire jumped the river and reached the north side, it found a population that thought they had time. Many of them had been watching the fire burn on the south and west, thinking they were safe behind the river. They hadn't packed, they hadn't prepared to leave. They had maybe watched from their windows with a kind of morbid curiosity that turned into blind panic when they realized the fire was actually coming for them too. The evacuation of the north side in the early hours of October 9th was chaotic in a way that was different from the west side evacuation. On the west side, there had been more time, more warning. On the north side, the fire arrived faster than people expected, and the density of residents trying to escape through relatively few streets and roads was extreme. People converged on Lincoln Park, which sat at the north end of the settled area. It was open ground, it was near the lake, it felt safe. And so thousands of people spent that night in Lincoln Park, huddled in the open, watching the city burn around them, keeping their children close, listening to the sound of buildings collapsing. The lake itself drew people too. Hundreds of people waded into Lake Michigan, standing in the cold October water up to their waists or their necks, protecting themselves from radiant heat, watching Chicago burn from the water. Think about that image for a moment. Hundreds of people standing in the lake in the middle of the night in October, watching their city on fire. There's a young woman in the historical accounts. Her name isn't recorded, or at least I haven't found it, who gave birth to a child in Lincoln Park that night during the fire. The baby was reportedly named either Phyllis or Francis, depending on which account you read. Born in the open air, in a park, while Chicago burned. That detail stays with me. Let's get close to it for a minute. Multiple survivors described the same phenomenon. The fire created its own weather. A large enough fire generates its own wind, pulling oxygen toward it, creating pressure differences that can actually pull people and objects toward the flames. Survivors described feeling a sucking sensation, a pull toward the fire as they ran away from it. Hats were pulled off heads. Papers and light objects flew toward the fire rather than away from it. The heat was described as something beyond what most people had ever felt. Not just hot, radiantly, blindingly hot, the kind of heat where you can feel it on your skin from blocks away, where you instinctively try to make yourself smaller, where your instinct is to cover your face with your arms. The sound of a large fire is something most people today have never heard at this scale. Survivors described it variously as a roar, a rushing sound, a crackling that became a kind of continuous explosion as buildings gave way and gas mains ruptured and material ignited suddenly. Several people compared it to a train, a massive, constant, unrelenting mechanical sound. And then there were the individual sounds within it, the pop and crack of burning timber, the shattering of windows from heat pressure, the thud and crash of walls and floors collapsing, the hiss of water from fire hoses evaporating almost instantly on contact with burning materials. Alexander Freer, the eyewitness I mentioned earlier, described watching a man whose coat had caught fire. The man didn't even seem to know it at first, just kept walking with this slightly dazed expression until someone knocked him down and beat out the flames. The disorientation people experienced was extreme. The combination of heat, noise, light, smoke, and sheer terror produced something close to a dissociative state in many survivors. They described feeling like they were watching themselves from above, or feeling strangely calm in moments of obvious danger. This is actually a recognized psychological response now. When stress exceeds a certain threshold, the brain sometimes goes into a kind of autopilot mode. People acted on instinct rather than reason. Some of those instincts saved them. Some didn't. I want to pause the narrative for a second and talk about the people who tend to get left out of the popular story of the Chicago fire. Most of the famous eyewitness accounts come from white, middle-class residents who could write, who later published their memoirs or gave interviews to newspapers. Their experiences are well documented. But Chicago in 1871 also had a substantial black community, largely settled in an area on the south side. There were immigrant communities, Irish, German, Scandinavian, Polish, Czech, living in dense tenement housing in the most vulnerable parts of the city. There were poor workers living in whatever they could afford. These communities were hit harder and recovered slower than the wealthier parts of the city. A family in a crowded tenement building on the west side had far less time to react than a family in a house on the North Shore. They had fewer possessions but also fewer resources to replace what was lost. They had less access to the emergency relief that poured into Chicago from around the country in the weeks after the fire. The total number of deaths from the Chicago fire is usually given as approximately 300 people, which, given the scale of the disaster, actually seems low. And historians have long suspected the true number was higher, particularly among poorer residents whose deaths were less likely to be officially recorded. What we do know is that about 100,000 people, roughly a third of Chicago's entire population, were left homeless by the fire. That number is staggering. 1 in 3 Chicagoans woke up the morning after the fire with nowhere to go. And the relief effort that followed is actually one of the more impressive chapters of the story. So let's get to that. But first, let's finish the night. By 2 a.m., October 9th, the fire has been burning for more than 5 hours. The city is almost incomprehensibly different from what it was 24 hours earlier. Entire neighborhoods that you knew, that had streets and shops and houses with people's furniture and books and clothes inside, are just gone. Not damaged, gone. Burned down to the ground. Some stone buildings still stand, but hollowed out, their interiors destroyed. The fire is still going. You're somewhere north of the main fire now. Maybe in Lincoln Park, maybe on the lakeshore, maybe in a street that hasn't caught yet. You're exhausted. Your throat hurts from the smoke. Your eyes are burning. If you ran quickly, you might be wearing your night clothes and nothing else. If you had time to grab a coat, you're luckier than most. Your children are with you, or you're trying to find them. The accounts of families separated in the chaos are some of the hardest to read. Parents who grabbed children and ran and then realized they had 2 of their 3 kids. Not 3. Neighbors last seen running in the wrong direction. People who went back for someone and never came out. The fire creates a particular kind of human suffering because it moves fast enough that split-second decisions become permanent ones. But here's something interesting that the accounts also show. Alongside the terror, there was community. People helped each other in ways that went far beyond what you might expect from strangers. A German family who had a wagon loaded most of it with the belongings of their neighbor, an elderly widow who couldn't carry anything herself, a man who described stopping 6 times during his escape to help other people, carrying children, lifting an old man who'd fallen, pointing the way for a family that was going the wrong direction. Chicago in 1871 was a city of many communities, different ethnicities, different classes, different neighborhoods that didn't always get along in ordinary times. That night, a lot of those barriers dissolved in the simple shared reality of the emergency. Not entirely. There are also accounts of looting, of price gouging, of people taking advantage of the chaos. Human nature in a disaster is not uniformly noble. It's just human. At some point in the very early hours of Monday, October 9th, it starts to rain. Light rain. Not enough to put out the fire on its own. The fire had already consumed most of what it was going to consume. But the rain, combined with the fire's own exhaustion after burning through so much of the combustible material, combined with the heroic and continued efforts of firefighters who had now been working for nearly 12 hours straight, all of it together began to slow the fire down. By about 3 a.m., the fire's advance started to slow noticeably. By dawn, it was contained, not fully out, but no longer spreading. When the sun came up on the morning of October 9th, 1871, the people of Chicago looked at their city. Here's what they saw. About 4 square miles of the city had been destroyed. That's an enormous area, stretching roughly from the near south side through the central business district and up through the north side. More than 17,000 buildings were gone. Gone meaning not just destroyed, but literally reduced to ash and rubble, foundations exposed, streets covered in debris. The business district, the commercial heart of Chicago, was almost entirely gone. Banks, newspapers, hotels, offices, stores, wiped out. The Tribune newspaper, which had its offices in the middle of everything, had lost its building. The Chicago Times lost its building. Every major hotel in the city center was gone. And yet, the Tribune published the next day. They borrowed a printer's equipment from another city. They produced a paper. Because this is Chicago, and Chicago doesn't stop. This became, very quickly, the defining story of the aftermath of the fire. Not the destruction, but the speed of the recovery. Let's say you survived the night with your family. You've been in Lincoln Park or on the lakeshore or at a neighbor's house on the far north or south side. And now, Monday morning, it's time to go back and see what's left. Walking back into the burned district, the first thing that struck survivors was the silence. A city that had roared all night was now almost completely quiet. The fire sounds were gone. The animal sounds were gone. Those were the most unsettling absences, because normally a city in 1871 was full of the sounds of horses and dogs and birds. Now there was nothing. The second thing was the smell. Smoke, yes, but also something underneath the smoke. A heavier, more complex smell that people struggled to describe. The smell of everything that had been in those buildings. Food, fabric, chemicals, wood, the contents of people's lives, all reduced to the same fine gray ash. The third thing was the landscape. Reporters who came to Chicago in the days after the fire described it as looking like a ruin from ancient times, like photographs of Pompeii. Stone walls still standing but empty, their windows just dark holes. Chimneys rising from lots where houses had been, surrounded by nothing. Safes, the heavy iron safes from banks and businesses, sitting in the middle of empty lots where the buildings around them had burned away completely, looking almost comical in their solitude. And your house? If your house had been in the path of the fire, it was gone, not damaged, not salvageable. Gone. Everything in it was gone. Think about what that means, practically and emotionally. Your furniture, your clothes, your children's things. Photographs. And in 1871, photographs were not casual things, they were formal portraits, expensive, often the only images that existed of family members who had died. Gone. But also practical things. Your money, if you kept it at home. Your business papers, your tools, if you were a craftsman. Your inventory, if you were a shopkeeper. Many people's entire financial lives were in that house, and it was gone. Let me give you some numbers, because I think the numbers matter here. The fire destroyed property valued at approximately $200 million in 1871 dollars. Adjusted for modern values, that's somewhere in the range of $4 to $5 billion. Some estimates go higher. More than 17,000 buildings destroyed. About 73 miles of streets. Pavement and all. 120 miles of wooden sidewalk. 2,000 lamp posts, bridges, warehouses, 90,000 people homeless on the morning of October 9th. Some counts say 100,000, approximately 300 confirmed deaths. Though, as I mentioned, the true number is likely higher. Businesses destroyed, hundreds, hotels, newspapers, banks, law offices, commission houses, retail stores, saloons, theaters. The economic infrastructure of a major American city, largely gone. Insurance companies, many of which were based in Chicago, went bankrupt in the aftermath because the claims were simply too large to pay. Some national insurance companies paid their claims fully. Others paid partial amounts. Others failed outright. Homeowners and business owners who thought they were insured found themselves with worthless policies. And here's an interesting detail. Many of the personal fortunes tied up in real estate and property weren't insured at all because it simply wasn't common practice to carry full insurance on everything you owned. People lost their life savings overnight in a very literal sense. Chicago didn't wait to start rebuilding. Within days, not weeks, days, construction was beginning in the burned district. There's a famous image of a Chicago businessman setting up a small wooden sign in the ruins. All gone except wife, children, and energy. That's probably apocryphal, but it captures something true about the psychological response of Chicagoans to the fire. The city declared martial law briefly to prevent looting and maintain order. General Philip Sheridan, who was already stationed in Chicago, took command of maintaining order in the city. This was somewhat controversial. Civil liberties concerns were real. But the city was also genuinely on the edge of breakdown in those first days. Relief poured in from around the country and around the world. New York sent money. Boston sent money. Cities across Europe sent money. Supplies, food, blankets, clothing, building materials came on trains from every direction. Within a week of the fire, more than $5 million in relief had arrived. Churches, schools, private homes on the unburned south and west sides, public buildings, all became shelters for the homeless. The sheer scale of housing 100,000 suddenly homeless people in a partially destroyed city was a remarkable logistical challenge that the city somehow managed, imperfectly but adequately. There's an interesting political dimension here too. Mayor Roswell Mason was overwhelmed and eventually essentially stepped back from leadership, leaving things somewhat in the hands of General Sheridan and a committee of prominent businessmen. This raised real questions about the relationship between military power and civilian government during emergencies. Questions that are, frankly, still relevant today. The Relief Committee distributed food, clothing, and money. It also controlled who received relief and who didn't, and there are accounts suggesting that immigrant communities and the black community received less generous treatment than more established white residents. This wasn't unusual for the era, but it's worth noting. Here's something that might surprise you. Almost immediately after the fire, there were people claiming it had been set deliberately. The most persistent theory pointed to a group called the Communards, a reference to the Paris Commune, which had just occurred earlier in 1871 and deeply alarmed the American upper classes. The idea was that radical agitators had deliberately set fires across multiple American cities simultaneously. Fires did break out in Peshtigo, Wisconsin, and parts of Michigan on the same night as the Chicago fire. More on that in a moment, which seemed, to some people, too coincidental to be coincidence. There was no evidence of deliberate arson as a cause of the Chicago fire. None. The simultaneous fires elsewhere are explained by the same weather conditions, extreme drought, strong winds, that made the Chicago fire so catastrophic. But the conspiracy theory served a social purpose. It allowed wealthy Chicagoans to blame their losses on a threatening outside force rather than on the city's own reckless development, its wooden construction, its inadequate fire codes, its exhausted fire department. Blame the radicals. Don't look at the choices that made the city so vulnerable. The O'Leary family, meanwhile, became scapegoats of a different kind. Catherine O'Leary, an Irish immigrant woman, working class, Catholic, was blamed in the newspapers almost immediately. The cow story cemented her reputation as the person who burned Chicago. She spent the rest of her life refusing to talk about the fire, avoiding the press, living quietly. She died in 1895, having never publicly addressed what happened. In 1997, the Chicago City Council officially exonerated both Mrs. O'Leary and her cow. A bit late, but there you go. Now here's the part that genuinely blew my mind when I first learned about it. The Great Chicago Fire is famous, and it was catastrophic. 300 deaths, $200 million in damage, 100,000 homeless. But on the same night, The same night, October 8th into October 9th, 1871, a fire broke out in Peshtigo, Wisconsin, a small lumber town about 250 miles north of Chicago. The Peshtigo fire killed somewhere between 1,500 and 2,500 people. That's not a typo. The Peshtigo fire, in terms of human death toll, was the deadliest wildfire in recorded American history. It killed 5 to 8 times as many people as the Chicago fire, depending on which estimates you use. It happened on the same night, and almost nobody has heard of it. The reason is simple and a little brutal. Chicago was Chicago. It was America's second largest city. It was a commercial hub. Its press was powerful, and its connections were nationwide. The story of Chicago burning was, by definition, a national story. Peshtigo was a small logging town. Its newspaper offices burned down in the fire. The people who might have told its story were dead. Chicago absorbed all the attention, all the resources, all the national focus. This disparity in how we remember the two fires tells us something true about how history works, and about whose stories get told and whose don't. The weather system that created the conditions for both fires, the drought, the winds, the tinder-dry landscape, was the same system. The October 8th fire event was a regional catastrophe that stretched across multiple states. Chicago just happened to be the most famous part of it. Here's where the story becomes genuinely inspiring, if you're in the mood for that. Chicago rebuilt fast, faster than anyone expected. Faster, honestly, than was probably wise in some cases, which led to its own problems. But the speed and ambition of Chicago's recovery became one of the defining stories of American industrialism. Within a year, most of the burned area had been rebuilt. Not rebuilt to what it had been before. Built to something new, something better. The fire, paradoxically, gave Chicago an opportunity to reconstruct itself with newer materials, newer designs, better infrastructure. The rebuilding of Chicago in the 1870s and 1880s is directly connected to the emergence of modern architecture. The Chicago School of Architecture, which gave us the steel-frame skyscraper, which shaped the way virtually every modern city in the world is built, grew directly out of the post-fire rebuilding boom. Architects came from all over the country to work in Chicago because there was simply more work there than anywhere else. Louis Sullivan, William LeBaron Jenney, Daniel Burnham. These names are pillars of architectural history, and their work happened in Chicago in the decades after the fire. The fire that destroyed Chicago helped create modern architecture. That's a remarkable thing. New building codes were implemented. Actually, Chicago had tried to implement stricter building codes in the months before the fire, but property owners and real estate interests had lobbied against them because the costs would slow construction. After the fire, suddenly there was political will for stricter codes. Some lessons have to be learned the hard way. The water system was improved. The fire department was expanded and better equipped. The alarm system was upgraded, and the population kept growing. By 1880, Chicago had more people than it had before the fire. By 1890, it had nearly 1 million people. By 1893, it hosted the world's Columbian Exposition, the World's Fair, showcasing itself to the world as a gleaming, modern, ambitious city. The Chicago fire didn't break Chicago. It accelerated it. I want to take a moment to talk about what survived the fire, because it's an interesting list. The Chicago Water Tower survived. It's still standing today on Michigan Avenue, one of the few structures from pre-fire Chicago that you can actually visit. It was widely mocked by Oscar Wilde during his American tour in 1882. He called it a castellated monstrosity. But Chicagoans have always loved it fiercely, maybe partly because it's a reminder of what came before. St. Michael's Church in Old Town on the north side largely survived. Or rather, its exterior walls survived, and it was rebuilt within its original walls. There are a few other buildings in similar situations. The fire largely stopped at Fullerton Avenue on the north side, so the neighborhoods north of there, what's now Lincoln Park, Lakeville, Wicker Park, still have some pre-fire architecture. Not much, but some. On the south side, the fire largely didn't reach, so neighborhoods like Bridgeport and parts of Hyde Park have some pre-fire buildings. Most of what survived is infrastructure, tunnels under the Chicago River, some of the deeper foundations, the general street grid. Chicago's grid street layout, which survived the fire, is one of the things that made rebuilding so logical and efficient. The streets were already mapped. You just built new buildings on the existing lots. What happened to people after the fire? Let's follow a few. Catherine O'Leary and her family rebuilt their home at the same DeKoven Street location within a year. Patrick O'Leary went back to work as a laborer. Catherine kept to herself, avoided attention, lived quietly for the rest of her life. The family was not wealthy before the fire and remained working class after it. The fire ruined her reputation, but not her family's physical survival. They were, in that sense, among the luckier ones. For ordinary working-class Chicagoans, recovery ranged from difficult to impossible depending on their circumstances. Families with skills that were in demand, carpenters, bricklayers, anyone in construction, could find work almost immediately in the rebuilding frenzy. Families dependent on businesses that no longer existed had a harder time. The relief organizations distributed aid for months, but the aid was finite and the need was large. Many families left Chicago and didn't come back. The fire scattered people in ways that the census records partially capture but don't fully explain. Families that simply disappear from Chicago records after 1871, presumably having moved elsewhere. For Chicago's business community, the recovery was faster. Wealthy merchants could often draw on capital reserves, on credit, on relationships and connections that the working class lacked. The business district rebuilt quickly because there was money to rebuild it and incentive to do so quickly. The residential neighborhoods of working people rebuilt more slowly. This is a pattern that shows up in disaster recovery again and again, in 1871 Chicago, and in every major disaster since. Wealthier communities recover faster because they have more resources, more social capital, more access to credit. The gaps between rich and poor often widen in the aftermath of disasters, rather than narrowing. What do we actually take away from the Great Chicago Fire 150 years later? A few things stand out to me. First, cities are more fragile than they look. Chicago in 1871 looked like a permanent, impressive, major American city. It had the architecture, the commerce, the population to support that impression. And in one night, 30% of it was gone. The infrastructure of our cities is constantly one set of bad circumstances away from catastrophe, whether that's fire, flooding, earthquake, or other disasters. The Chicago Fire is a lesson in urban vulnerability that we keep having to relearn. Second, individual choices in disasters matter enormously, but they're made under conditions of terrible information and extreme stress. The people who survived the Chicago Fire generally made better choices than those who didn't, but better choices often depended on luck, location, and access to information that wasn't equally available to everyone. We should be careful about celebrating the resourcefulness of survivors without also noting how much survival depended on factors outside anyone's control. Third, the Mrs. O'Leary story is a masterclass in scapegoating. Find someone, preferably someone who lacks power or status, preferably someone who belongs to a group that's already facing prejudice, and pin the blame on them. It's simpler than looking at the systemic factors that actually caused the disaster. Chicago in 1871 burned because it was built to burn. Bad codes, rapid unregulated construction, exhausted emergency services, drought. One Irish immigrant woman and her cow didn't do that. An entire economic and political system did. Fourth, disasters accelerate change. Chicago was going to be a great city regardless of the fire. But the fire forced the city to rebuild, and in rebuilding, it got to incorporate new ideas, new materials, new designs. Sometimes destruction creates space for something better. That's not a reason to welcome disaster, and we should be careful not to romanticize it. 300 people died, and 100,000 lost their homes. And that's not romantic. That's catastrophic. But history does show us that cities and communities that survive disasters and rebuild thoughtfully sometimes come out better on the other side. And fifth, the story we tell about a disaster says something important about the values of the people telling it. We told the story of the Chicago fire as the story of Chicago's triumph, its resilience, its speed of recovery. And those things are real. But we told it less as the story of Catherine O'Leary's wrongful scapegoating, or the story of Peshtigo's forgotten dead, or the story of the 100,000 homeless people who had to survive a Chicago winter in 1871 with varying degrees of help. Both stories are true. Which one we emphasize is a choice. Let me bring you back one more time before we close out. It's the morning of October 9th, 1871. The fire is burning its last. The rain is coming down lightly. You've made it through the night. You're standing somewhere at the edge of the burned district, looking at what's left. Maybe you're holding one of your children's hands. Maybe you're alone. The air is still gray with smoke and dust. The sun is somewhere behind all of it, giving everything a pale, uncertain light. In front of you, as far as you can see, ruins. The skeleton outlines of chimneys and walls. The strange flat openness where streets that used to be lined with buildings are now open to the sky, here and there, figures picking through the rubble. Looking for anything salvageable, looking for people, looking for something. Behind you, everything else. The parts of the city that survived, the people gathering themselves together, figuring out what comes next. Already, someone somewhere is making plans. Already, lumber is being ordered and foundations are being thought about. Already, a newspaper that lost its building is figuring out how to publish tomorrow. You don't know yet that this city is going to rebuild itself into something extraordinary. You don't know about the World's Fair that's coming, or the skyscrapers, or all the other chapters still to be written. You just know that you're alive. And your family is alive, and the city, some version of it, is still here. That's enough to start with. That's usually enough to start with. So that's the Chicago fire. Not the textbook version, but the version you'd have lived through. The fire that started in a barn on DeKoven Street on the evening of October 8th, 1871, burned for approximately 27 hours, destroyed 4 square miles of one of America's greatest cities, left 100,000 people homeless, killed approximately 300 people, likely more, and then, grudgingly, went out in the rain. And then Chicago rebuilt. If you want to go deeper on this topic, I'd really recommend seeking out the primary source accounts. Alexander Frere's memoir, the contemporary newspaper accounts, the letters and diaries that survivors left behind. The Chicago History Museum has an extraordinary collection on the fire, both physical artifacts and digitized documents, and a lot of it is accessible online. The water tower still stands on Michigan Avenue. If you're ever in Chicago, go look at it. It's not the most impressive building in a city full of impressive buildings, but it's one of the few things you can actually touch that was there on October 8th, 1871, when the fire started. There's something about being able to touch something that old, something that survived something that significant, that history books and YouTube videos can't quite replicate. If you've stuck around to the end of this one, genuinely thank you. This kind of deep historical storytelling takes a lot of research, and I love doing it, but it only makes sense to keep doing it if people are actually watching. So if you found this valuable, hit the like button. It actually does make a significant difference in how this video gets distributed. And if you want more of this kind of ground-level historical storytelling, subscribe and you'll get notified when the next one goes up. I'm already working on the next one. Let me just say it involves a different city, a different disaster, and an equally extraordinary story of survival and recovery. I think you're going to like it. See you next time.